For those of you of my age, you might recognise an Anderson shelter from World War II. It's a very nice art installation. And I just ask you, because we had difficulties last week, if I'm not audible, because I do speak relatively softly, could you please indicate so that we can do something about it? I mean, like I can speak up. Okay? Thank you very much. In his book, Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he tries to persuade us that we are becoming ever less violent, Steven Pinker comments that it is easy to document, but hard to explain, why young men are the most violent group within the human species. Elsewhere, he records research that indicates that it is in fact not young men, or even adolescents, who can claim this privilege. It is toddlers, in, I quote, the aptly named terrible twos. From the perspective that I shall use here, this is not the illogicality that it seems to be. Psychically, humans are historical persons. All of us are also still the toddlers we all once were. Although we develop from past to present, we must also trace a life backwards from present to some construction of that past that is still present in us. Of these toddlers, Steven Pinker quotes psychologist Richard Tremblay, and I quote, "Babies do not kill each other because we do not give them access to knives and guns. The question we are trying to answer for the past 30 years is, how do children learn to aggress? That's the wrong question. The right question is, how do they learn not to aggress?" That could go on the slide, I forgot. Yeah, thanks. By the way, I don't use PowerPoint for the argument, I use PowerPoint for illustrations, and sometimes I don't read the whole quote, I just take something from the middle of it so as to get on with the argument. And you can look at it. Well, it was this alternative question, how do they learn not to aggress, arrived at from a psychoanalytic perspective, that led me to formulate The Law of the Mother in a book on siblings, which I wrote in 2003. It's the mother who stops her toddler killing the new baby who usurps its place. Initially naming this The Law of the Mother was a sort of joke with the dead Jacques Lacan, who talked about the law of the father. Psychoanalysis privileges the vertical axis of intergenerational descent and ascent. It thus joins that branch of feminism which also emphasises the vertical, especially patriarchy. My object here is to shift the focus onto the horizontal. In warfare, young men largely kill each other, intra-generationally. Although women's exclusion from warfare is as central as an issue as men's inclusion, as a first stage, this talk gives attention to the creation of war's brotherhood. Women and men do not have different depth psyches, but their gendering consists in the deployment of distinct aspects of this psyche. Both sexes have the same violent urges, both are forbidden to put these into effect. With the horizontal law of the mother operative between her children, and then the vertical law of the father, boys are put on the path to become what defines a man by developing a certain use of violence for war. Women will have their non-participation in any violence ascribed as a characteristic of femininity, the weaker sex. So going beyond Richard Tremblay's observation about the terrible twos, warfare itself, I want to argue, is dependent on a prohibition of violence to the small child who persists in our adult selves. I am no expert on war, and all I hope to do is to suggest, from within my own disciplines of psychoanalysis, gender studies, and a background in literature, a way in which we may consider understanding war's place in the construction of society. My suggestion goes against the grain of evolutionist studies such as Azagat's Magisterial War in Human Civilization of 2006, and Steven Pinker's highly acclaimed thesis of Our Diminishing Violence, Better Angels of Our Nature, 2007. In both these studies, all forms of violence and warfare are treated as equivalent, as interchangeable. Pinker's claim that we're becoming less violent depends on this, which is to my mind a mistaken conceptualization of violence and warfare, as though they took place on a continuum. Instead, I suggest, illegal violence and legal warfare are divided by a prohibition. It makes quite a difference to how you think about a lot of questions within war. Although, of course, it uses violence, warfare is and must be created through a prohibition on violence. Prohibitions and allowances are the building blocks of human society. Wars and kinship are infinitely various. However, for society to exist at all, both human sexuality and the urge to kill are organised through prohibitions and allowances, with whom one may or may not have sex, whom one may or may not kill. This prohibition is both a condition of warfare's existence, and it is why and how warfare contributes to the construction of society, of human society, which we're trying to understand. As the historian of the Mediterranean, Fernand Braudel, points out, war's monuments and weapons are cultural artifacts. I'm afraid that that applies to elegant drones as much as to beautiful swords and stunning castles. Braudel has a general proposition that I want to highlight. Did the end of this particular war that he's writing about mean peace? Not entirely, he says, for by some apparently general law, warfare simply took on new forms, reappearing and spreading in this guise. I believe that it is a general law. That's a sort of en passant in Braudel, but I want to highlight it. War itself, or war and peace as dialectical terms, are always present as one of the main ways humankind becomes social. I think this is something we all know, but seem not to want to think about. Although other animals fight, doubtless with some degree of organisation, no species has warfare, any more than it has highly developed language or complex artefacts. Nor, as far as we know, do other animals have that persistent inner violence, an internal warring of my title, which is so major a feature of what we describe as clinical depression or melancholia. What I am calling warring is the prohibited violence, which is either turned inwards as a psychic malaise, melancholia, or outwards as spontaneous but unauthorized self-defense or as criminality. My title uses Hamlet, a play in which an important theme is the complex relationship between illegal violence, brother murders brother, and legal warfare. The murdered Hamlet should have been a soldier. The play ends, bear Hamlet like a soldier to the stage. The common root of legal and illegal violence, both of them, at either end of the scale, is fighting to survive, which we do as toddlers. This common source means that illegal violence will inevitably accompany legal violence, but that does not mean they should be confused. In today's warfare, a civilian will be raped or killed, riddled with the fallout of a cluster bomb. A so-called suspect will be tortured, imprisoned in a cage without trial for years. A population will be exterminated through genocide. Legal warfare reveals its traumatic origins in that, like all trauma, it is compulsively repeated. We compulsively repeat wars. But it shows its provenance in culture, as opposed to trauma, and in society building, by creating these artifacts and by fighting for gains, such as oil, well beyond basic survival. One can use this proposition of the conceptual importance of the prohibition on violence in many ways. Here tonight I can only offer a limited number of linked and connected observations. First, some observations about toddlers and the mother's prohibition of their violence. Second and third, a psychoanalytic and gender studies background as to how we might consider these. Fourth and fifth, I bring the two disciplines together to consider the boy's sister and the formation of the Brotherhood in warfare. I conclude with those excluded from warfare, women, Hamlet, and the wretched of the earth. So first, those terrible toddlers and the law of the mother. The typical difficulties and difficult behaviour of the 2 to 3-year-old are widely recognised. Paediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called the crisis experienced at this age a trauma of separation, that is, separation from the mother. The observations and case histories show that this crisis has in fact 2 dimensions, not one. There's the loss of the mother to the new baby, but there's also the acquisition of a new baby who takes the toddler's place. By the way, it took me a long time to think about this lecture, but it took me even longer to cut it down. And one of the things I had to cut out is explaining to people why it doesn't make any difference if there is no new baby, if you're an only child or a last child. There's always an expectation of one, but I had to cut that out of the talk, as many other things. Anyway, a new baby is expected to take the other's place, or does take the other's place. This is from Winnicott, Joan. She has experienced not only the trauma of separation from her mother, but also what I call a sibling trauma. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You'll see in the middle I've italicized. She pinches and even bites the baby and will not allow him things to play with. She will not allow anyone to speak about the baby, but frowns and ultimately intervenes. It's the 1930s. She was put briefly into a home because she was such a nightmare. And having no one to bite, she bit herself. Violence turning in on herself. It's all up there. The sibling trauma refers to the fact that the new baby takes the older child's place in such a way that for a time the toddler feels it is no one. Winnicott again, it's on the same slide, just to again quote the bit I've italicized. This is a child who calls herself the Piggle. She changes her name at this point because she doesn't feel she's anyone who calls herself the Piggle. She was not herself. In fact, she refused to be herself and said so. I'm the mummy, I'm the baby. Case histories are just overflowing with this material. It's not integrated into the theory. The toddler who was the baby feels annihilated. It had thought the promised baby would be more of itself. Instead, it seems a replacement. The toddler feels chaotic. When it is slightly older, she or he, probably 3 to 4 years old, can formulate the urge it had as a toddler and still indeed has. The urge is kill or be killed. Louisa and Joseph were aged 4 and 2 when Raffi was born. The new baby was charming. The older children were by this time good friends. One day when Raffi was just 3 weeks old, his siblings walked in from playing and announced to their mother that they did not want Raffi anymore. They wanted to throw him out of the window. The family lived on the 7th floor of a tower block. 4-year-old Emma pushed the pram of her new brother Julian very fast down a steep hill. Reprimanded by her mother, "You could have killed him," Emma countered with, "Would that have been so very earth-shattering?" Well, of course we can laugh and take refuge in the fact that small children do not know that death has dominion and is forever, but actually they want it to be forever. They don't want that sibling back again. Isn't it rather the other way round, that these universal experiences of infancy that we all have give us the template for our later acts of violence? If killing the baby were not prohibited, it would be Claudius's murder of King Hamlet. So it is the mother's prohibition that forbids killing the kin and later the symbolic brotherhood. The prohibition opens the male child's way to killing the enemy. The brother's prohibition against killing the new baby, or its substitute friend, is the first absolute law of infancy. It comes on top of her socializing the infant into cleanliness, good eating habits, and the rest of all of which are based on what is forbidden. I was the other day in a public waiting room meditating on war, as I have been for a little while, and all I could hear was the several mothers saying no to the many children. It was really quite funny. I mean, there was just nothing else that you could hear in this waiting room but no, don't, no. Well, do not kill is a much more serious law than anything else that she's socialized them to. Do not kill operates laterally, intragenerationally along a horizontal axis. To help renounce the wish to kill, the child must use its narcissistic love for the baby, whom it thought would be more of itself. He was told, "Oh, wouldn't it be lovely for you, there's a new baby coming?" Well, that means more of me, I'm the baby, more me. It must love the baby, then its brother, then its neighbour, then its friend, then its symbolic brother, as itself. Not being allowed to kill the sibling opens the horizontal social world of the peer group, which according to Pinker's researches, after infancy becomes more active than the parents for social formation. Human sociality as a horizontal structured institution, I argue, starts here. The child has to give up the mother of infancy and go off to play with peers. The boy goes on eventually to fight the enemies who form their own brotherhoods, but who are also the heirs to the murderous hate he had for the baby who turned out not to be more of himself, but to be someone different. Boys are encouraged to find a substitute opponent outside, girls to keep the violence directed inwards masochistically. Of course, there is no absolute division, and there are much individual variations. The sibling trauma is a necessary trauma, which we all more or less survive, and which, by emptying out the present as trauma do, facilitates a rite of passage from the old state of infancy to the new state of childhood. Following the mother's law, the baby, hitherto the object of lethal jealousy, becomes instead an object of both affection and denigration, love and hate and contempt. My second observation, the psychoanalytic background. Psychoanalysis is widely attacked and even more widely ignored. For me, its object of understanding unconscious processes and its means of doing so remain valid and important. It works with and tries to describe the establishment of human culture in the inner world, the unconscious psyche of the individual. This culture starts as the diversely expressed but nevertheless general or universal rules, regulations and laws that we are all meant to obey without even thinking or even consciously knowing about them. The rules and laws are most clearly seen in their many failures. The psychoses, madness, neuroses, dreams, slips of the tongue, pen, various psychopathologies of everyday life, and the acting out of what has been prohibited, as in the illegalities of war that come with the legalities of warfare. So these are the more or far less serious moments when the drives and desires which have been prohibited come back into evidence, accompanied and distorted by the ineffective regulations against their expression. What is allowed is defined by what is not allowed. Melancholia stands at the illegitimate individual end, warfare at the legitimate and social end, along a scale of wishes and their prohibition. Prohibitions and allowances of sexuality dominated the psychoanalytic picture until World War I. In 1920, trying to grasp the psychology of the traumatic neuroses which are so prevalent in war then as now and all time, Freud proposed a death drive, which subsequently, in an exchange of views with Einstein, he made responsible for human war as such. This human drive, this death drive, to return to an inorganic state, individual death, takes for Freud the outward form of the destruction of others, killing. To this, I am adding the central place of prohibited violence on the horizontal axis, not just that one leads to the other. The illegitimate violence will become repressed, producing pervasive feelings of guilt for the violence one wanted and therefore somewhere unconsciously still wants to commit. This violence and guilt figure in the depression of the melancholic. Although it has by no means always been regarded as a pathology, depression is recorded in all known human societies. Today, it is considered one of the most serious mental health problems affecting some 121 million people worldwide. I suppose I got to thinking that I'd talk about war and melancholia or clinical depression because they seem to be the things that dominate under society, and therefore I need to understand them. It is expected that by 2020, clinical depression, which is our name for melancholia, will be the second leading contributor to the global burden of disease. I thank a student of mine for this information. It already accounts for approximately 850,000 lives by suicide every year. Shakespeare's Hamlet expresses the feeling well. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. The mother's law demands that the prohibited violence be sublimated, socialised, and reconfigured in the brotherhood of warfare. My third observation, gender. Warfare is gendered not just incidentally, that's Pinker's and Gatt's position. It's not that they don't pay tribute, so to speak, to gender differences, female-male ones, but I argue it's not just incidental. Even if you make it a big incident, it's warfare's very construction is gendered, and it works both ways. Warfare is a means of constructing gender just as the heterosexual gender distinction and the homosexual ones is a means of constructing warfare. Humans uniquely mark birth with this gender distinction. It's a girl, it's a boy. However, this only comes to have meaning for the recipient, not for the newborn baby, so to speak, but with the birth of the usurper baby, which restages the distinction of birth for the toddler. That's when it suddenly dawns on the toddler what that means to be a girl or a boy. The same gender sibling is more like oneself. He can thus be assimilated into the brotherhood, or she can join the sisterhood. Gendering thus will be boy-boy, brotherhood, girl-girl, sisterhood, girl-boy, siblinghood, all have to be features of our work in gender studies. In the ideals of boys' games, in the fantasies of chivalry, and in the so-called just war, a brotherhood of combatants fight another brotherhood of combatants. In the reality of adult warfare, this at best is only partially so. The enemy turns out not to be only the rival brotherhood, but everyone who seems to threaten our survival, men, women, and children. From the viewpoint of the terrible toddler still latent in the adult fighter, the enemy will be nominally another brotherhood, but this enemy is predominantly the hated aspect of the usurping baby in its various manifestations. Although warfare may be planned patriarchally, it is younger men banded and bonded together who do the fighting. A social bond depends not only on those who are included, but also on those who are excluded. Even today, 99.9% of combat troops are men. Women are excluded for the very reason that they are women, not because they cannot or do not want to fight. The problem is that women's exclusion from fighting seems to have meant that they are also largely excluded from analyses of war. I have to just blow the trumpet of gender studies in this university for 1 minute by saying that last week we had a wonderful lecture by the visiting professor of gender studies for these next 2 terms, Akbar Ahmed, who was lecturing on the war in terror and its concentrated destruction of tribal societies. And he talked about the place of women in this destruction of the tribal societies. A very, very interesting talk. But I'm not going to talk about women because I think you have to start with thinking about the brotherhood. A gender analysis thus demands, I did actually have the sisterhood in it, but it got cut out. A gender analysis thus demands, for starters, a dual perspective. Why and how is the brotherhood of fighters created both by the inclusion of young men and the equally important exclusion of women? Why don't we have both genders? What does the status of inclusion and exclusion tell us about the constitution of the combatants and of the enemy? Furthermore, absence from fighting does not mean absence from warfare, and therefore, as well as male-female relations around fighting, the female-female sisterhood needs to be part of the picture. What are women doing in warfare? We can see women wondering who on earth they are in the gendered conscription, in the ungendered conscription of the Israeli army. And to another student, I owe the introduction of the wonderful work on women soldiers, of whom this artist, Rachel Papo, is one of them, who is working on portrayal of women artists. And the portraits of these Israeli women artists are very, very interesting indeed. They are in the army, but they're not in the army too, and not in terms of knowing who they are and what they're doing there. Fourth observation, the boy's sister and the brotherhood. The world treats the category women as objects of men's perspective rather than as subjects of their own history, which is both distinct from and shared with men. Psychoanalysis, like many other disciplines, has reflected this perspective. Gender studies has the task of analysing it. As I said, I'm looking here as a first stage, critically rather than reflectively, I hope, on what man has made of man from the boy's perspective. Forbidden to kill and urged to love the baby as itself, neither gender can fully assimilate the opposite sex into its newly discovered gender identity. The boy cannot love his sister as himself, except insofar as he, so to speak, neutralizes her gender and incorporates her into the brotherhood in the workplace or in warfare. And it's interesting how many people subscribe, or for example, Simone de Beauvoir ends the still outstanding book, The Second Sex, with her wish that women could enter the liberty and equality and fraternity of society. This is still the perspective. I mean, that was the 50s, late 40s, but it's still very much the perspective. Sorry, I've lost my place. Oh yes, so he can neutralise and let her into the brotherhood, which is what happens so often in the workplace, and so happen, unless you get divided workplaces, of course, or in warfare. If they're in the same one, then she becomes part of the brotherhood. The boy effects a psychic split. Where he loves his sister as different from himself, it is as the smaller, weaker, lovable baby whom he can cherish and protect. Where he hates the different baby, that baby becomes the enemy and the girl, woman. When the brotherhoods of war legitimately kill each other as rival brotherhoods, they each also kill the enemy with the illegal survivor's violence against the hated baby, which has returned from repression. For both genders, the sibling is the object of a taboo on incest. However, sexual play, same sex or other sex, is widespread among sibling and peer children. In relation to each other, brothers and sisters are not future mothers and fathers. That's the vertical axis and comes next, so to speak, but sexual partners or objects. The boy's sister will become the wife of the boy's friend. In a sense, his wife displaced onto his friend's wife. The wife offers legitimate sexuality for the man. When the illegitimate rage returns in war, she is the sexual prostitute, camp follower, or victim of rape, which, as we now know, is as prevalent as killing in war. Most important of all is that the prohibition against sibling murder enables the symbolization of brotherhood. A prohibition means that the kin baby brother is split. In his good aspect, he is the same as the boy, and his bad aspect, he is the enemy. In being split, he, so to speak, disappears. The prohibition means that the baby goes, just as for the boy, the mother can be mourned because she's lost, because the boy can't be the mother like the girl can be the mother. The boy can lose the mother, so the boy can, as it were, lose the baby into friend or foe. Once you've lost something, you can symbolize it. You can't symbolize something that's there. So there has to be a loss of something. So he can lose it, and that's different from the girl's perspective. But he loses the baby and turns her into something else symbolic as he loses the mother and becomes symbolic and can be displaced onto other people. The boy's brothers are his actual literal kin and symbolic, all those who are categorized as such on the loved side of the divide. That's a symbolic brotherhood that is is our society, almost. Well, yes, it is. Survival of any, well, along with patriarchy, I suppose. Survival of any sort brings with it the ecstasies of being alive. That's what survivor guilt's about, is that you're so thrilled to be alive. War's brotherhood makes this ecstasy a centre point. Stephen Pinker quotes Vietnam Marine writer William Broyles, who in an article in Esquire magazine entitled Why Men Love War in 1984 wrote, and I quote, this is from this Esquire article by this vet, "The enduring emotion of war is comradeship. A comrade in war is a man you can trust with anything because you trust him with your life. War is the only utopian experience most of us ever have. Individual possessions and advantages count for nothing." Oh, sorry, it should be up on the board. "The group is everything. What you have shared with your friends. It isn't a particularly selective process, but a love that needs no reasons, that transcends race and personality and education. All those things that would make a difference in peace." And it's got my italics again. War offers the apotheosis of brotherhood. That's Shakespeare. As Broyle says, the comradeship or brotherhood of war transcends race, personality, and education. A commander today, as Henry V at Agincourt yesterday on the board, can only conduct war if he creates a brotherhood. He has to make Falstaff's rabble, people who are just mucking around in the fields, he has to turn them into a brotherhood, and then they'll fight for their lives. But reciprocally, as a general law to which Ferdinand Brodel pointed, so far we have all wars also in order to renew the brotherhood of society in both war and in peace. Thus, human society, as we have known it, has not been able to exist without recurrent warfare. Fifth observation, those excluded from war, the disinherited, Hamlet, and women. By this point in thinking about this talk, I've got to this thought: human society as we've known it has not been able to exist without recurrent warfare. Warfare. Society is warfare. I mean, it's not the only thing it is, obviously, but it's there. So as I got to this point in preparing this talk, I found that though I was thinking about warfare, the words of the poet Gerald Manley Hopkins from his Leaden Echo were reverberating through my thoughts, and I couldn't get them out of them. The Leaden Echo goes, "Be beginning to despair, despair, despair." Luckily, the Leaden Echo is transformed into a golden echo in Hopkins. For him, it's religion, not me. Spare, there is one, yes, I have one. So despair becomes spare, there is one, yes, I have one. There were 6 despairs. So I too have one hopeful thought. It is well known that the disaffected do not support war. Although most of the world can be rallied into the brotherhood of war, most do not belong to it. Through what we might here call the secondary ideologies of religion, nationality, ethnicity, the excluded men can be temporarily incorporated into the military brotherhood. The vile, in Shakespeare's words, can gentle their condition. Briefly, they may share broils, Vietnam, utopia. Those who used to be referred to as cannon fodder, Falstaff's erstwhile companions, Pistol, Nym, Bardolph, and the rest, the wretched of the earth, are called out of poverty and immiseration to fight. And once the battle is lost or won, it is to a peacetime of poverty and immiseration that the vast majority, the mass of humankind, dead, maimed, or alive, will be returned. Women, by definition of their womanhood, are excluded from war, but they can likewise be drawn into the fraternity or play female supportive roles. Women, however, we must remember, are excluded, and they are 51% of the population. As one of the first books of feminism to be produced, I think perhaps the first in this country, from this university, called itself the Chinese saying, "Women are half the sky," in fact slightly over half the sky. Hamlet is neither a woman nor one of the disinherited masses. He is the son of a conqueror king, a Renaissance prince preeminent in the brotherhood of man. Yet Hamlet cannot understand how Fortinbras, or by implication anyone, can possibly go to war. Why do men go to their graves like beds, he asks. The all-hasty incestuous marriage of his mother to her brother-in-law has made Hamlet turn his aggression inwards, as a girl must, to become still today our icon of melancholia. His melancholia, or clinical depression, in it he attacks himself, first of all as a woman, and also sort of both, first of all, as a disinherited of the earth. Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I! Why, what an ass am I! Must, like a whore, unpack my heart with words, and fall a-cursing like a very drab, a scullion. Fie upon it, foe! A whore, and the lowest forms of prostitution, a drab, a scullion, meet up with asses, rogues, and peasants, the lowest of the low. Melancholics experience themselves as the disinherited. However, any sort of threat to life can jolt the depression, the clinical depression, and turn the illegitimate violence once more outwards. The spy Polonius, who might have been the murderer Claudius behind the arras, and Claudius's proxy murderers, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, threaten Hamlet's life. Suddenly, out of his melancholia, he fights for his life. My title. In my heart there was a kind of fighting. His depression ends and he can act. Hamlet has known that beneath the legitimacies of war's killing, there lies prohibited murder. He has been no more able to kill his father's murderer than he has been able to fight a war. At the tragedy's end, the all-important prohibition has become the thinnest line separating illegal murder from war's legal killing. The carnage in which all the main characters in the play are murdered ought to have been a battlefield, and the dead Hamlet should have been a soldier. As with the masses of the disinherited, beneath the culture of warfare, there is murdering and being murdered. The boy toddler who has managed to sublimate the violence with which he would get rid of his baby brother, throw him out of the window, and thereby use his aggressive energy for warfare, turns sibling murder into warfare's killing. Are there any other ways to get out of this prohibited murder? Although he did not pursue the question, Freud, in his exchange with Einstein, thought that the most important question was why some people do not want to fight. Why do some people not want to fight? He thought it had more to do with aesthetics than with ethics. Shakespeare's Hamlet is a great poet. If war contributes to the construction of society, then those who, instead of wanting war, are engaged in aesthetical enterprises will in fact be using more than others their prohibited violence in artistic rather than war enterprises. Destructiveness and violence are absolutely crucial for seriously good creativity. Matisse, for instance, talked of his work in terms of rape. That's what he was doing. When something is prohibited, the energy that drove it has to go somewhere. Sublimations are what psychically contribute to civilization. The boy becoming a warrior is sublimating his uncontrolled violence. What we are looking for, therefore, in thinking about how we might end wars, if we ever could, is a different route from sublimation than warfare. What we're looking for, therefore, is some different route for us to find sublimations than warfare. It would be an untenable fantasy to dream that the use and sublimations of prohibited violence by the making of art could take the place of warfare's construction of society. But I think it is a dream in the right place. When we in the UK followed America into bombing Baghdad, the cradle of civilization, the congregation in St. Paul's Cathedral was invited by the preacher to cross the bridge to that other cathedral, the Tate Modern, to contemplate Cornelia Parker's exquisite IRA blasted garden shed. Today, we may note the wondrous outpourings of artworks by Arab women from the war-torn Middle East. It's on in Brick Lane at the moment. In last Sunday's History of the World, Andrew Marr, there was an extraordinary pause when Andrew Marr stood back from the exhausting, I don't know if anybody watched it, I was completely shattered by the time I finished watching it, exhaustingly violent age of plunder and rise of capitalism. Marr showed us how when Japan closed its doors, not that Japan's anything to go by in other ways, but when Japan closed its doors to this epoch of the age of plunder and the rise of capitalism, and had 250 years of peace, that was the time when the extraordinary beauties of Japanese civilization were concentrated and created. Thank you.